Okay, so I'm going to save the introduction and we're going to get right into the topic of discussion. We're going to be talking about Abaddon. And Abaddon is known as the destroyer because Abaddon is a force of absolute destruction. But what is actually being destroyed is the illusions and the attachments that we have, or the false sense of self identity that we created as a protective adaptation in relation to trauma that is existing in our system that we may be largely in avoidance to. And we're using the false identity as kind of like a blocker in relation to what's actually going on a deeper level. So not only do we die to the attachments and die to the identities when we're working with Abaddon, but we're also brought into the main influencing suppressed negative energies that caused us to even have those attachments and to have that false identity in the first place. Abaddon is a gateway to and a personification of the 11th hidden sphere of Thoth on the Kabbalistic tree, which is also known as the Abyss. In the Kabbalistic system, after you work through the first 7 spheres, there's a threshold that separates those first 7 spheres, the bottom of the tree, from the next 3 or the upper spheres, which is going to be the top of the Kabbalistic tree. And the top of the Kabbalistic tree represents our upper chakras. And when we're going through Kabbalistic initiation, when we cross the abyss and move into the upper part of the tree, we're now learning how to embody and basically have an awareness that's more centered in our upper chakras. Of course, this is going to be in balance with all of our chakras, but I think you know what we mean. We're learning how to operate from a higher density state of awareness. But in order for this to happen, we need to process all of the lower frequency energy that's often stored in our energetic field and in our body. And we also have to let go of the illusions and the attachments and the identities that we form to combat that energy which is stored inside of us. And this is what the abyss experience does for us. It's going to manifest experiences which are meant to act as triggers to bring up those suppressed energies that I'm referring to, and also to pressurize, challenge, and to help us let go of, the identities, the belief systems, the perceptions, the attachments, the relationships, the unhealthy coping, and things of that nature that we are very identified with. Because when we're moving to the top of the Kabbalistic tree, we can't necessarily take a lot of those things with us, and we can't channel higher density energy into the body if we have all these lower frequency energies in the body, and if we're still creating our reality from that false self, identity type of state. So Abaddon is a very dissolving, very disillusioning type of force. And when I started working with Abaddon, I was actually incarcerated. I was a gang member. I was very identified with being a Crip, and I created this false identity for myself. I was very attached to abusing substances and being very violent. I used to walk around with a sharpened piece of metal every day, and I was getting into fights and altercations and things of that nature. And I was just very attached to the whole gang member persona or gang member identity. But what ended up happening as the natural byproduct of me working with Abaddon is that identity that I was very, very much embodying for such a long time, that I was very identified with. Well, it began to get dissolved. There was chaos and there was catalyst that was manifesting in my life to pressure the reality and to pressure the version of myself that I was very identified with, and I was putting in so much energy to putting so much energy into. So Abaddon destroyed those attachments and destroyed those illusions and actually helped me shift into a completely different timeline. Because to be quite honest, the timeline that I was existing in was a timeline where I was either going to end up dead or I was going to spend the rest of my life in prison. And the character that I was deciding to play was a character that had already spent so much of his life incarcerated. But when I started working with beings like Abaddon, I started to shift my perspective. I started to see through the veils. I started to die to the attachment, and eventually I moved into the timeline where I'm the person that I am today. I am such a totally different person that sometimes it's hard to even believe that I was ever that person. Like, I know I was, and I remember it, but, as I live my life and I'm just present in the moment, and, as times kind of move forward, it's almost like that becomes more and more of a distant memory. Once again, I remember it, I know it happened, but it's just hard to believe that I was ever that person because I don't feel anything like that person. And a lot of this evolutionary momentum that I created that all led to me being the person that you see now started with entities like Abaddon. And I was working with many entities at the time when I started creating this momentum for myself and I started experiencing these different evolutionary shifts. But Abaddon was definitely one of the main influencing forces behind all the growth that has come into manifestation, behind all the shifts and all the deaths that I experienced to also experience, a rebirth, a new sense of self, a new sense of self-identity, and a new timeline that I have now moved into. Abaddon is a personification of the abyss, meaning Abaddon is also an aspect of the death current. So when we're working with Abaddon, there's going to be these dissolving energies that come into our lives, and there's going to be things that we need to let go of. That could be the relationship you're in. That could be the job that you're working at. That could be the living location. Maybe there's a certain way that you viewed yourself for a very long time, but it's rooted in early childhood trauma, and you don't necessarily realize that. Well, if you're working with Abaddon, therefore you're working with death, you're going to have to let that go. And if you don't, you're going to keep manifesting things that are going to challenge that aspect of your sense of self-identity or whatever it is, the belief system, the perception, the relationship, the unhealthy coping, until you actually let it go. There could be a lot of catalyst when we're working with an entity like Abaddon, especially because Abaddon is associated with the apocalypse in the book of Revelations. And the apocalypse isn't the end of the world, but it's actually the end of the world as we know it. So this apocalypse happens on a collective level, and it also happens on a personal level, and Abaddon can bring you into that personal apocalypse to where you go through a burning away of all of the illusions that you were very attached to. And this is also going to bring you into a lot of these trauma-based energies that are in your body so you can feel them and then release them, giving you the ability to step into a much higher state of consciousness. And that's actually what the apocalypse in the book of Revelations is all about. It's all about this dying process that gets initiated into the mass collective so a rebirth can eventually come from that. In the book of Revelations, Abaddon is associated with this bottomless pit. And the bottomless pit represents the abyss within every single one of us, the abyss that stores away our trauma, stores away our fear, stores away, these very dense, suppress negative energies that most people are in avoidance to. But to move into that rebirth, we have to die to the aspects of our psyche that are like these limiters that we create that block us off from experiencing those things, because we can never be a protective adaptation, and we can never actually authentically embody the source consciousness if, we have these false identity constructs, and if we have these trauma-based energetic frequencies that are the very thing that are fueling us to essentially create that. So in the book of Revelations, even though most people are viewing it, viewing it from a religious lens, it's actually about a mass collective ego death that sets the stage for a mass collective rebirth to actually take place. And in Revelations, Abaddon has essentially this army of locusts that comes from the abyss, and then it harms, or actually the word is torment or tortures, anyone that does not have the seal of God on their forehead. And what this represents is people that are in harmony with the source energy. So people who are not in harmony with the source energy, Abaddon is this evolutionary force, that initiates catalyst for these kinds of people, so they can let go of the attachment and let go of the illusions that they are so identified with and so attached to and putting so much energy into, so they can then process all of that energy that they've been running away from that's underneath the surface of all of that. And as they're processing it, feeling through it, they're also releasing it. And this is when they get the opportunity to raise their frequency exponentially. So Abaddon plays this role on an individual level, where we go through this individual apocalypse, this individual dying process. And Abaddon also plays this role on a mass collective level. And when we're working with Abaddon, we're going into the abyss, and what's also in the abyss, aside from our trauma, is going to be an infinite amount of data, an infinite amount of realities, and an infinite amount of different probabilities that we can actually start pulling out of the abyss and manifesting into our physical reality. There's actually a bunch of different timelines of ourselves where we're existing, and we can go into the abyss to actually quantum leap into that desired timeline. And I understand because I did it. I understand because I'm the living, breathing proof that that can happen. Because once again, I used to be a totally different person, and when I started working with Abaddon, it started creating these shifts that completely changed the way I view myself, completely changed the person that I thought I was. So when we're going into the abyss, there's this infinite amount of data that, even though we can't process it all consciously, the human brain can't even fathom it, on a subconscious level, we are integrating that, we could say, into the energy field. We're downloading that experience into our being so we can live our life in a more authentic way, and even shift into a timeline where we're already that version of ourselves. All possible realities, all different, I'll say it like this: all the different timelines of yourself are existing right now. Past and future, the way most people view it, are actually an illusion. But in reality, everything's kind of like this film strip, and it's all happening side by side, just in different frequential realities. So just different frequencies of existence is the best way I know how to explain it. And as we move into the frequency of that timeline, we then move into that timeline because it's already happening. So when we're going into the abyss, we're going into this space of absolute primal chaos, which we can utilize to shift our reality. And the reason why it's considered to be primal chaos is because to the human brain, it's unfathomable how all of these different versions of ourselves can actually be existing side by side at the same time. And essentially these versions of ourselves are, all connected to the same soul structure, which our higher self created so we can have the human experience that we're having. So this data can, or these infinite probabilities can seem very, very dissolving because we're so accustomed to viewing reality in a certain way that when we do go into the abyss, these energies can be of such a high frequency that it completely breaks down what we think to be true, or it completely breaks down the way that we view ourselves. So this is one component to the abyss, is this infinite probability, all of these different timelines that we can experience, and this infinite amount of data and information that's accessible to us. Now, another component of the very dissolving qualities of the abyss is going to be the death energy, which is an energy that transfers something from one state to another, which could be very dissolving to the human consciousness as well. And another component of this is the trauma. So we store away, trauma-based frequencies in the abyss. And when we're going into the abyss, because technically we're stepping outside of time as the average person perceives it, we're also moving into the energies of all of our different lifetimes that are actually happening simultaneously. And we're going into the suppressed negative energies of those lifetimes that are happening simultaneously as well. So think of it like this. Even though you're only experiencing yourself as you are right now, and there's a reason for this, the human brain can't process, living hundreds of different lifetimes all at once that are all connected to the same soul. So we experience ourselves as like one version of ourselves. But in reality, there's all of these different versions, and they're having different experiences. And the human experience could be very traumatizing. And a lot of times as humans, we will bypass that trauma, so that trauma has to get stored somewhere. And the heaviest traumas and suppressed energies that that we basically bottle away or suppress, they end up in the abyss. So when we're going into the abyss, we're not only experiencing trauma from this lifetime, but we can experience trauma from different timelines where we are existing, and we could go through a processing of that energy, which can feel very, very dissolving and can come with a lot of heavy emotions, but this is also immensely beneficial. Now, the same way the abyss exists on an individual level, it also exists on a mass collective level as an accumulation of all the suppressed negative energies that people basically, bottle away. So that accumulates in another layer of the abyss. And then there's a layer of the abyss that exists on a solar system, galaxy, and even universal level that stores away the shadow aspects, memories, and certain energies of planetary consciousness, extraterrestrial consciousness, and solar system, galaxy, and universal consciousness as a whole. So this can feel extremely chaotic when you're experiencing it. And there's all these different layers of abyssal consciousness that you can access through the medium of working with Abaddon. And before I move on to the next part of the video, there's also a level of abyssal consciousness that's associated with the very beginnings of the formation of our planet and the very beginnings of the human species. Think about all the very traumatic things that hunter-gatherer civilizations and human beings have been through, going back to the very beginning of the human species all the way till now. Well, that energy goes somewhere, and where that energy is uplined is to the abyss. So you can work with all of this through the medium of working with Abaddon, through the gateway that Abaddon provides, and this is very beneficial to the self. to increase our power and evolutionary potential. And this is also very healing for the entire mass collective if you're able to process the experiences that come with entering the current of Abaddon. Now, I see people that work with Abaddon. They'll often talk about Abaddon like Abaddon's this hateful and very wrathful energy, but I don't think they're actually realizing that it's not Abaddon that's hateful or wrathful, but we're getting brought into that suppressed emotional resonance that's inside of us when we're working with Abaddon. But because of a person's belief filter, they might actually think that it's Abaddon that feels this way, and that's what his energy feels like. And yes, the energy can be very pressurizing because it's a manifestation of the abyss, a manifestation of the primordial chaos, which can be very dissolving. But that dissolving actually brings up those suppressed emotional resonances within ourselves that, when it comes to Abaddon, can seem a lot of the time to have to do with anger, aggression, and wrath, because these are the emotions that a lot of people avoid, or a lot of people just don't have a healthy connection with in general. So when we're working with Abaddon, we're actually learning how to connect with those suppressed negative energies in a healthy way, and we're learning how to extract a positive from those very, very heavy emotions. And when we're working with Abaddon, we're also working with those emotions on a collective level, so that suppressed negative resonance that the collective kind of stores away in general. And this is why it can feel like Abaddon is like wrathful or angry. It's not Abaddon that's angry, it's just what we're getting brought into when we're working with the current of Abaddon. There's actually definitely more of a handful of times where I've worked with Abaddon and not only felt a lot of anger and a lot of aggression myself, but people around me that normally wouldn't fight or necessarily argue in the way that they were would start fighting, and they would start arguing. And this is because Abaddon is going to basically bring the environment itself into the abyss. Abaddon is this very abyssal current. So let's say you live in a home with 4 or 5 people and you start working with Abaddon, you might actually see those 4 or 5 people start having a lot of conflicts and a lot of falling outs. And this is because Abaddon, due to his energetic signature, is just going to naturally trigger those things to the surface. And the deeper purpose behind this isn't just to piss people off, but it gives people the opportunity to suppress those lower frequency energies that are actually keeping them from being a more authentic version of themselves. So this could actually be immensely healing if a person knows how to work with those heavier energies within the self. Abaddon rules over the Klipothic abyss, as well as the sphere of Thaumael, which is at the top of the Klipothic tree. Abaddon has a lot of influence over Satariel, which is governed by Saturn, and as well as Golachab, which is governed by Mars. And what this is actually showing is the influence that Abaddon has on a mass collective unconscious level, and as well, a solar system level as well. This is a very influential force. And when we're working with Abaddon, we can actually get pulled into Klipothic initiation without intending it, just because of the nature of this energy, the nature of this spirit being a gateway to the abyss and being a personification of the abyss as well. So when I started working with Abaddon, I wasn't intending to initiate through the Klipoth yet. I did become aware of what it was, but I didn't think I was ready. But what happened is I realized that I had actually been initiating through the Klipoth on an unconscious level. And, eventually I became aware of it, and then I started connecting with the Klipoth, in a conscious way, but some of the deepest levels of primal soul development that we can go through can actually be initiated just by connecting with Abaddon. And this is why a lot of people interpret Abaddon as such a heavy force to work with, due to the deeper initiatory process that can unfold just by connecting with this energy. And I've gained so much value through working with Abaddon. I have completely shifted and completely changed. But this involves me having to work through some really heavy emotions. This involved me having to let go of unhealthy relationships, unhealthy coping, unhealthy belief systems, limiting perceptions. And I had to let go of these different masks and these different identities I created for myself as they were burning away, which, at times was extremely uncomfortable because I was very much in resistance to some of the changes that pulling this energetic current into my body and into my life was essentially triggering for me. But if you're a person that is ready to do the work, and if you're a person that's literally willing to die over and over and over and over again to actualize your highest evolutionary potential, Abaddon can certainly be a very beneficial force to work with. And I don't think this is an energy that everyone has the capacity to work with. And I actually think this is why that a lot of people in the occult community, they work with, other entities that seem to be much more popular than Abaddon is. I think this is because on a subconscious level, those individuals know, what would potentially unfold in their life and within, their being if they were to connect with an energy like Abaddon. Now, all of the infernal divine entities are very powerful, and they're going to initiate change and catalyst due to the primal nature of their energetic makeup or energetic structure. But Abaddon just seems to be a little heavier than your average, demon or average infernal divine entity. So you absolutely want to be ready for what can unfold when you're working with this energy. And it has so much to do with letting go, because Abaddon, being associated with the death current, is always going to be associated with letting go and letting everything unfold, knowing that the primal chaos is only going to set the stage for a more authentic sense of order to manifest within your internal and external reality. But if we try to attach to what is being destroyed, there's a lot of room to end up in a really bad mental state. And there's different occultists that actually speak about this. E.A. Coetting spoke about how he worked with Abaddon and completely lost everything. Behemoth X talks about how, this basically talks about the nature of Abaddon. And I saw him make a video one time about how we shouldn't judge people that work with Abaddon because they quote unquote can look like they're ready for the hospital bed, and that, he was basically explaining how they can end up in really dark places mentally and things of that nature, and that's just the natural byproduct of sometimes working with Abaddon. And that can certainly be true. It doesn't mean you'll absolutely end up in that really dark mental place. If you have the proper foundation and in education, you're much less likely to end up in that space. But even with the proper education and the proper preparations, it could be a difficult experience working with Abaddon. Just the nature of the human psyche and how we identify with certain things that aren't real, Abaddon is going to bring you into your raw, truth. So I say all of this to say that Abaddon is an extremely beneficial force to work with if you know what you're getting yourself into, and you're willing to let go of the illusions that are going to be stripped away from you. And whether a person works with Abaddon in a conscious way or not, the entire mass collective is actually being influenced by this very powerful extraterrestrial intelligence. Abaddon has a high level of influence over the development process of the human species, especially right now because we are collectively experiencing an apocalypse. There's a death being initiated in relation to the old world so we can move into a new world. Abaddon is a main initiating force of this death cycle, and it is Abaddon who opens up the bottomless pit so we can experience the things that we've been running away from, so we can release those things once and for all, and then move into a higher state of consciousness on a mass collective level and as a species in general. So, ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate every single one of you, and I will certainly catch you in the next video.